All right, we are now.
All right, we are now. All right.
Awesome. Looks like we're live on various social media platforms. We'll just welcome more folks to join us and get started here pretty soon. So thank you. Again, welcome to those joining us. We'll be getting started here pretty soon. We just wanted to allow our attendees to hop on if they're hopping on through Zoom, and everyone streaming in on our live feeds. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. Bernal. I'm the director of Pueblo Action Alliance, and I'm going to be sort of opening the space here tonight. I appreciate those that going to help us address this crisis. And so this webinar tonight is an opportunity for us to debunk some of these greenwash solutions. And we hope to achieve that through popular education, through relationship building, and of course, free, prior, and informed consent, because we, as Indigenous people, have cultivated so much knowledge and wisdom and science over the centuries. This should lead us to inform our own analysis on carbon trading, offsetting schemes, net zero. We're going to get into a lot of that tonight. Because here in New Mexico, we're going through our state legislative session, and we're seeing a lot of climate policy that is full of a lot of these false solutions that we've been really working hard against. Even right now, there is a hearing happening for HB 228, which is the third introduction of hydrogen policy during this short 30-day session. And us at Pueblo Action Alliance, SWAP, and Yucca, and other allies have been firmly standing in opposition to all of these false solutions at the legislature. And while, of course, we have gained a lot of support in our efforts, many people do believe that these market-based solutions can lower greenhouse emissions. And so tonight and tomorrow night, we are regrouping with Indigenous and frontline leaders to provide this intergenerational take on greenwash solutions and climate fallacies. So I want to again thank you all for being here tonight. And I would like to spend some time to hand it over to Reyes DeVore and Seneca Johnson to give our land acknowledgements. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Te no a ni toata e ni washale pahin te banopa shumpa. Good evening, everybody. My name is Reyes DeVore. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez, also known as Walatoa or Hemish. I currently serve as the Community Programming Director for PAA. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you to all the organizers for putting this webinar series together for our communities. Before we get started with tonight's agenda and panel, we would like to take a moment to honor the land we stand on today. We would like to pay respect and provide acknowledgement that we are coming to you today from Southern Tiwa territory. There was once 12 Tiwa-speaking villages that lived both north and south of the Rio Grande that stretches through so-called Albuquerque. The Tiwa villages fought to defend their territories in the winter of 1540 to 41 by the settler expedition of Coronado. It is important to note that the Tiguay War was the first named war between European settlers and indigenous peoples in what is now stolen land. Today and always, we should honor Tiwa people and their communities as we live and organize in their territories. We all occupy and organize on stolen indigenous land bases. Therefore, we must always support, respect, and honor sovereignty and self-determination of indigenous peoples. And so thank you, and I will go ahead and pass it to Seneca.
Thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Seneca. I'm from the Muskogee and Seminole Nations of Oklahoma, but I grew up here in New Mexico, and I'm a co-founder and campaign organizer for Yucca. And yeah, so just as Reyes honored the Tiwa land and our Tiwa relatives, I would like to honor the land that we're organizing on here in Tewa territory. So yeah, I just want to always remember that we are organizing on stolen land, and that our struggle for economic, social, and environmental justice must be rooted in that understanding, so that we are all working towards the rematriation and restoration of this beautiful place that we all call home, back to the lands of their original caregivers. And we want to extend our gratitude and solidarity to our Tewa relatives. So thank you. I'll pass it over to Trenton, I believe.
Hi there, everybody. How's it going today? Thank you for tuning in to the No False Solutions webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about debunking greenwash solutions and really developing an understanding about what is net zero, what is real, what is net zero, hydrogen, false solutions, what's going on with the hydrogen, the HB6 timeline, and in a sense, just really getting a definition of debunking greenwash solutions. So with that being said, hello everybody, my name is Trenton DeVore. I'm from the Pueblo of Walatoa, also known as Jemez Pueblo. I am one of Pueblo Action Alliance's youth organizers alongside my partner Jalen Littlebear, and we are the co-founders of PAA's youth cohort, Cultivating Roots and Resistance. I am here with you all today to introduce an amazing panel with Corn, who is the environmental justice organizer for Pueblo Action Alliance, Alejandra Lyons, who is the environmental justice organizer for SWAP, the Southwest Organizing Project, and Seneca Johnson, who is a campaign organizer for Yucca, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. All of these folks have brought together in a united voice that has denounced false solutions for climate mitigation here in our ancestral lands and sacred territories. Thank you to our panelists for bringing a wealth of knowledge, and thank you for being actively involved in these offsetting schemes, these net zero bills, COP26, and of course, grassroots education. Like I said, our panelists today are going to be Corn, who is the environmental justice organizer for Pueblo Action Alliance, Alejandra Lyons, who is the environmental justice organizer for the Southwest Organizing Project, and Seneca Johnson, who is a campaign organizer for Yucca, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. So before we step into the panel, as we say, I had a question for a poll that we're going to drop into the chat. I don't know if who was I going to pass that to Mick or so to say. All right, and there we are. So a poll was just dropped into the chat, and by any means, do you know the difference between net zero and real zero? Difference is yes or no. Go ahead and take your time. I thank you very much for your active participation, y'all. All right, it looks about like 82% of the people on this chat have participated, and I understand that a lot of them are facilitators and partners as well. As it looks like we can see. Okay. So the poll has ended, and the question was, do you know the difference between net zero and real zero? It looks like 64% of the people in this chat said yes, that they know the difference between what is net zero and real zero, and 36% said no. All right, that definitely gives us a positive understanding of where we are going to be. I'll go ahead and share the result. All right. And with that being said, I would like to introduce the panel as we do have it. I'm gonna go ahead and ask Corn from Pueblo Action Alliance, what's it called? To go ahead and come off of mute. How are you doing today, Corn?
Hey, Trenton. Hi, everybody. I'm doing well. Can you guys hear me okay?
Can hear you well, can hear you well.
Awesome.
All right, well, it's good to have you here today, Corn. I have a few questions for you, and go ahead and take about 5 to 10 minutes to answer each question. And all right, well, my first question for you today is, can you explain the work you have been doing with Pueblo Action Alliance and their No False Solutions campaign?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. Yeah, so one of our main goals we started with last year at Pueblo Action Alliance. I've been with them for about a year now, a little over a year actually. So when we started, we're like, all right, what are we gonna do? And we decided to start a narrative shift about what false solutions are. So we know that we are needing immediate climate action now. And we believe educating our people is one of the main things we need to be doing to really transform the current climate, both environmentally and systemically. So we started gaining more knowledge on what false solutions are, how they work, and how they will potentially be implemented here into our local governing systems in New Mexico. So we went ahead and collected educational material, right? Then we translated educational material together, meaning we went over it, we studied it together, we discussed it with each other. And then we produced educational material from the stuff we learned, you know, more easily digestible information for our community members who don't really understand what it means in a legal sense, or when it's, you know, on the United Nations Declaration of Independence, or United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, sorry. And so we like took all this technical information, made it more easily digestible, and produced a bunch of really cool educational material. And we wanted them to really understand, as well as like all of our colleagues, what we actually talk about when we say false solutions and what we mean. Because in the end, as Indigenous people, this all goes back to our communities, impacts our families, you know. And so it's one of the reasons why we actually wanted to have this webinar series too, that we're partnering with SWAP and Yucca and other Indigenous and frontline groups to produce these webinars. So we can discuss it with our communities and learn more together. And we've also been working on numerous pieces of popular education, including like workshops, zines, and like even legal white paper reports surrounding the Greater Chaco region and our rights as Indigenous peoples. So we have FPIC zines and FPIC workshops available to explain the process and implementation of free, prior, and informed consent and its origin in UNDRIP. And we also have a Chaco zine that highlights the impacts of the oil and gas industry in the Greater Chaco area. We produced a white paper in collaboration with the UCLA Tribal Law Clinic surrounding co-management processes in the Greater Chaco region, and how we can use FPIC to our advantage as Indigenous people. So yeah, after we got a good understanding about what false solutions are, we actually hosted our inaugural carbon conference gathering last summer in June. We gathered local grassroots, frontline, and Indigenous organizations to educate them about carbon market mechanisms and give them the materials they may need to teach their own people how to spot false solutions. We held discussions, workshops, really got down to nitty gritty about what type of carbon market mechanisms could potentially be coming to our region and how we could start working together to deflect them. So that was hosted at Los Sardinas Institute in South Valley of Albuquerque. Well, we all learned so much together. And so we're already planning our second annual gathering around carbon pricing this summer. So keep a lookout for that. But that's pretty much what we've been doing for the past year now.
No, I appreciate that, Corn. That was an amazing response. I had a quick question, especially for the audience here. Where can we find this material, so to say? Is it on the website?
Yeah, sorry, I had this a little bit written down, but I had it bolded, so I thought it was something else. But yeah, you can download all these materials I mentioned on the Pueblo Action Alliance website. That's puebloactionalliance.org. They're free and have some easily digestible info for like all of our communities as Indigenous folks and frontline folks and, you know, community groups.
I appreciate that, Corn. And I also have a second question for you too as well. Corn, can you explain the difference between net zero and real zero?
Yes, I can definitely break that down for you. So let's put net zero and real zero into perspective for everybody. So I'd like to actually break down the term net zero and go through each word in detail with you. It really helps to define each word individually to actually realize how they work together in a phrase. So let's do that real quick. So net, right? So according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the definition of net reads to receive by way of profit, right? And according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, zero is defined as the absence of a measurable quantity or a state of total absence or neutrality. All right, so the definition of net zero as a phrase, according to like English language and definition, is the word net is the pay for, and the word zero is neutrality or absence, right? So net zero literally translates to paying for neutrality, which is extremely accurate when it comes to net zero as a false solution, because that's what it is. It's not actual zero. It's false. You're paying for the neutrality, so you're not actually getting it. And it just means if they can afford it, which most oil and gas industry, extractive industries can, they just pay a fee for a legal quote unquote zero. They don't have to stop polluting at all. Just pay imaginary credits that say you can pollute that much, right? All right, so that's net zero. So real zero, let's break that down. Real is defined in the dictionary as actually existing or happening, not imaginary or not fake, false, or artificial. And we know that zero is defined as total absence or neutrality. So by definition, real zero translates to actual neutrality. And this is the real solution, right? Net zero is not real zero. They're two different things, two different phrases, two different meanings. And that should be a huge takeaway from this little talk right now. The only way to achieve real zero and establish true solutions, that means keeping fossil fuels in the ground and preventing further damage to our environment and our people. Net zero is just another term the big extractive corporations use to run from actual accountability. So that's just a quick go around for y'all.
No, I appreciate that, Corn. It really defined what net zero was, and especially what real zero was, and it's really allowed us to hone in on the education that's going here, because they use a lot of these languages. They use their language to really trip us up, and I think that's something that we need to educate ourselves on too as well. But I appreciate that, Corn. I appreciate you for your time. I wanted to go ahead and pick on Alejandra Lyons for a little second. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm so happy to be here with you, Trenton. I know, we've gotten a lot of time together, being in Santa Fe, fighting together. And so, yeah, thank you for having me as a panelist.
Well, it is great being in solidarity here with you. I had a question as how has SWAP been involved in debunking the climate solution based on market mechanisms, and how that relates to COP26?
Yeah, thank you, Trenton. So yeah, for those that don't know me, my name is Alejandria Lyons. I'm a Chicana organizer, working with the Southwest Organizing Project on environmental and climate justice. And, I was really brought into this space to talk about false solutions and learning about this through Pueblo Action Alliance. You all, with the help of some folks like the Indigenous Environmental Network, have been putting on these conferences, hosting them locally here, and inviting all of us who have a stake, either as Indigenous or land-based folks that come from acequias and these other frontline groups here in New Mexico. So, I really want to thank you all, especially Julia and Reyes and you all that have laid down the foundation to bring us all into the space, who have been, shouting here in New Mexico for years that this is upon us and that it's going to be, fall solutions are here in New Mexico, and New Mexico is really the place for, as we see, we have coal, we have fracking, so many of these dirty industries. So the Southwest Organizing Project was brought in to this, during the time of the Energy Transition Act, because our governor currently, Michelle Lujan Grisham, has been talking about trying to become one of the world climate leaders, right? And I was brought on to the It Takes Roots delegation for COP26 this year through the Climate Justice Alliance to be a key spokesperson, primarily to talk about the Kirtland jet fuel spill. But it was there that we really learned about these issues of false solutions and how they were going to be marketed. So, during the time in COP is when they passed Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, which allow for carbon markets. So during the time where we were in Glasgow, we were being taught, and we held actions against this. So, SWAP is pretty new to this work, but it is all thanks to our Pueblo and other Indigenous allies that, we've been asked to have a stake in this, because our communities will also be faced with the consequences of things like net zero and carbon offsets.
No, I appreciate that very much. For those who don't know what COP was, could you mind explaining that, so to say?
Yeah, no, thanks for reminding me. I'm always talking at this larger level because we work at so many different levels at SWAP. So that's a good reminder. So COP is the Conference of Parties, and what we deemed it as was the Conference of Polluters, because it is the time where all the folks who are tied to the United Nations come to discuss climate, right? And so this year, COP26 was held in Glasgow, Scotland. It's kind of been held in the European areas for a while now. It's held in different countries, but this is where folks come to create solutions to climate, right? And what we found is that the highest amount of people who were there were large oil and gas and fossil fuel representatives, even more than countries, individual countries. So, and what we were doing there is to take back the narrative to talk about frontline communities, because traditionally, people of color and our climate justice organizations are not brought into that space. It is a very political, very like greenwash space.
I appreciate that. I had a second question for you too as well. So offsetting carbon has been deemed as a climate solution out of the COP. But can you explain this global offsetting schemes a little bit more?
Yes. So carbon offsetting and carbon market schemes allow carbon emitting actors, folks who are, the highest polluting industries, the fossil fuel companies, to purchase credits to, quote, kind of offset their emissions, right? So it's called cap and trade, because essentially what these companies can do with the allowing of things like net zero and carbon offsets, which we're fighting. This is part of, here in New Mexico, House Bill 6. And this is why our organizations will absolutely not allow that here in New Mexico, because what it does is it essentially allows the fossil fuel companies to continue doing what they're doing, right? They are one of the major actors who are creating information campaigns that say net zero, carbon neutral, all these things. Those are the kind of words to look for when looking for these greenwashing tactics and words. So the reason why we're against this as frontline communities is because it doesn't lower emissions. And there's a lot of academic research that has been done all over the world, in South Africa and China, in Latin America, and so many places that show this doesn't reduce emissions. And so what it does essentially, so let's say you have a polluting industry, somebody who is allowing a lot of greenhouse gases into the air, right? They're going to have a certain cap, a certain ceiling to pollute. And then after that, they have to trade to make it their polluting more green, right? And how do they do that? They purchase offsets. So let's say you have a polluting industry in California that's burning coal or whatever. They're going to go and they're going to buy offsets somewhere, doesn't even have to be in California, to perhaps like buy lots of land to plant trees, or to use agricultural offsets to say that they are no longer emitting, right? So that to us, that doesn't make sense, because what it's doing essentially is it's allowing people who have the most amount of assets, the most amount of money, to buy their way out of the problem that they created. And this is why we need to pay attention to who's behind these issues. And so, another thing that I want to point out is that, a lot of the talk that we've been having here in New Mexico, especially from Indigenous communities, is that we will not allow for these markets to happen because we cannot commodify what is sacred. And, it's important that we look at land-based and Indigenous knowledge to say, because even here in New Mexico, where we're saying we want to allow offsets for 10% of that net zero by 2030, with that 10%, we are allowing this market to open up here in New Mexico, and we absolutely cannot let that happen.
So once these somewhat say developed markets come into our spaces and our organizations too as well, the language, it really helped us understand, like I said, the difference between the net zero and real zero, and connecting back to what Corn was saying about these carbon market mechanisms and how they really maneuver the system too as well. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the conversation too as well. She is going to be, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, by any means, hit the chat. We have a team of people who are constantly reaching out to those too as well. But we have some time here at the end to open up the space for some conversations and for that question too as well. But I would like to bring on Seneca Johnson for Yucca, which is the United for Climate Crisis Action. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's go ahead and get this started. My question for you is, we've been seeing hydrogen being reintroduced into the legislative session for the third time, and that's just today. Can you explain why hydrogen is a false solution and why it's a priority for New Mexico?
Yeah, sure. So as you all know, I think we have till about 2030 to completely change the way that our society runs and radically reduce and eliminate the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted. We're quite frankly running out of time. We have less than a decade, and the entire world is really grappling with this transition. And New Mexico in particular, I think, is facing a lot of pressure to do this, as we should. Because we are in the top 3 oil generating states in the US, and we also share the Permian Basin with Texas, which is, I think, one of, if not the largest oil basin in the entire world. And we're incredibly reliant on oil and gas industry here in New Mexico. I think it makes up over a third of our state budget, and so it has kind of like a stranglehold on our state. And so when we are really needing to transition in this way, a lot of people and our legislators in particular are looking at hydrogen as a type of bridge energy because it supposedly burns clean. However, that's just untrue because there's no such thing as clean hydrogen, and it's greenwashing. So hydrogen would actually prolong our reliance on the fossil fuel industry because 99.8% of hydrogen currently produced comes from fossil fuel sources. So just going a little bit deeper into it, there's 3 types of hydrogen. One is gray hydrogen. It's the most common because it is the cheapest, and it also pollutes a lot. The way it works is hydrogen is produced using steam reforming, which rearranges the molecular structure of hydrocarbons. So I've heard numbers from anywhere to 4 kilograms to some studies say 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide is released in the atmosphere for every 1 kilogram of gray hydrogen produced. So that's a 10-to-1 ratio. And that's completely ridiculous, and that's not something that would reduce our emissions at all, really. And then there's blue hydrogen, which is what's really being pushed in New Mexico. And that uses the exact same process as gray hydrogen, but it also tries to use a carbon capture and sequestration method to try and literally capture and the carbon that's released in the process and, you know, bring down emission levels. I think it's important to note that blue hydrogen emissions are actually 20% greater than directly burning natural gas or coal for heat, and 60% greater than just, you know, straight up burning like diesel oil. That's according to like a recent Cornell study. And yeah, hydrogen production is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas pollution. So that's just like as far as like the actual process and the CO2 that's released. But going into like, sorry, this is such a big problem. Like a lot to it, I mean. But going into like the carbon capture and sequestration, I think it's important to note that this is an unproven technology. It's never been successful to such a large scale that it would, you know, be something that we could use to really, you know, be effective in reducing emissions. And, you know, there's no equivalent exchange. The amount of carbon dioxide that's like released is not the amount that we'll be able to capture. And so I think it's important to note that. Also that sometimes it is used for enhanced oil recovery, basically meaning they take the carbon that's been emitted and they kind of put it back into the ground to get more and more oil out. So it can just kind of add on to that cycle. Yeah, so those are like the most common ones. And the 0.02% of hydrogen creation is called green hydrogen. It's created using electrolysis, and that's like supposedly like the cleanest version. However, you know, as I mentioned, it makes up an incredibly small percentage because it's really like resource heavy and energy intensive. About 18 tons of water is used for every 1 ton of hydrogen produced. So, I mean, in New Mexico, we've been in a drought, like, I think pretty much my entire life. And it doesn't seem like that's going to be ending anytime soon. We don't really have the water resources for that kind of thing. So that's just kind of a look at like some of the main problems with hydrogen and why it's just, you know, not a good solution and also not feasible at all for New Mexico.
I appreciate your time for these conversations too as well, because New Mexico has one of the biggest methane plumes over the United States, and especially just over us in general, and that's in the Four Corners region. So, and it's really disheartening because a lot of these bills that are going to be introduced are going to be affecting, you know, our Indigenous communities, you know, our low income communities, and especially putting a lot of our English learning students, you know, at risk too as well. And I appreciate you really coming in here and talking about this and uplifting that too as well as a youth, you know, for the youth, because this is our generation. You know, as a recently new father, I commend you for doing the work that you're doing, because it's really uplifting what we're doing too as well. You know, shout out to Yucca, shout out to Seneca. You know, you are doing amazing work. I just had an optional question for you too as well. If you could give us a timeline through the New Mexico legislative session and some of the bills that back hydrogen, you know, net zero and offsetting.
Yeah, I can definitely do my best. My memory can be a little spotty, but like I've been so entrenched in the legislative session that maybe I'll be able to keep track of all the ups and downs with hydrogen. So as I mentioned, it is, you know, something that our legislators and specifically our governor is really pushing. It's like one of her top priorities this year. And because of that, I think it's been really like fast tracked. Like, you know, they've been pushing hydrogen in like every way possible. And so there's been a variety of different bills that were introduced and are, you know, have been heard, are still being heard regarding hydrogen specifically. I think one of the first major bills was HB4. It was sponsored by Representative Lundstrom. And yeah, like in the first committee that it was heard in, I think the environmental justice community like showed up, Frontlines community showed up, just individuals who care about their future. You know, they all showed up and were able to give public comment and just speak, you know, with very definitively saying, you know, no, we're not going to accept hydrogen for our communities. And, you know, HB4 actually got tabled and it was a really huge victory. And there's, you know, several other bills in, that was on January 27th, I think. And there's several other bills kind of like in the days after that we were looking at and watching and trying to make sure didn't have hydrogen or any of these fall solutions. One of those being like HB6, like I think Alejandria was talking about, which I think doesn't necessarily mention hydrogen by name, but does have offsets built into it. And I think it's important to talk about how just the undemocratic process that's been following hydrogen. As I mentioned, HB4 was tabled, and then pretty much all of the language from HB4 was brought back into HB 227 under a different name. And it was meant to be heard this past Monday. And it was, going to be fast tracked and only put into one committee. And, that was unacceptable. So, Yucca, SWAP, Pueblo Action Alliance, Indigenous Lifeways, and several other groups really working to like put pressure to kill that bill on Monday. And it actually did end up being tabled before it was even in committee. And now, again, the language for hydrogen has been brought back again, even though community has repeatedly said no to this. And it's been brought back, and they shortened it, and now it's being heard actually like right now during this webinar with HB 228. And so there's just been like really repeated processes throughout this entire 30-day session to try and get it through, because it is only a 30-day session. We have like a week and a half maybe left. And so that's kind of like the zombie bill that has been hydrogen. And I'll just mention that like in this process, as I mentioned, it's been very fast tracked. And so there's been like very little consultation with Indigenous communities at all throughout this process, which is one of the major issues just outside of like the science and how it's not viable. There's been very little consultation, and it would continue to like burden the same communities that have been overburdened for years. So yeah, I think it's difficult for me to speak to some of the other bills because there's a lot of them that have had to deal with these false solutions. But with hydrogen specifically, that's kind of what it's looked like being brought back the third time tonight. And we're hoping we can kill it, but who knows if it'll be brought back again, even so.
No, I completely understand, and I completely agree. It is a lot of hard work. We are doing a lot of hard work here. We are dismantling 500 years of colonial occupation. We're dealing with generational and childhood trauma at the same time. So it's a lot is going on. But with that being said, and I commend you on your work, because Indigenous people and grassroots organizations have been at the forefront of extractive colonialism since colonial governments first began making agreements and laid the foundation for infrastructure that's currently here in New Mexico. So I appreciate our panelists. I appreciate you guys being here and uplifting the conversation too as well. I wanted to leave some space and some time, for our audience to really hop in and, get involved with our panelists. They're here, I wanted to give some space and some time for you guys to get your answers, to get your questions heard, and make sure your voice is heard too as well, because that's exactly why we're here. Bottom up organizing, y'all. And like I said, I just want to give like a good little 10 minutes for a question session, so to say. Cool. And for those who do have a question, you can either write it in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. And like I said, we have people in the Zoom link, in the Zoom chat that are here working and uplifting and doing a lot of that, the background work, the logistics. So shout out to them, and they are going to be the ones that are going to really help us throughout this moment too as well. So if you have any questions, by any means, just raise your hand. There's a little option for those who do not know. It's in the reactions. If you have your reactions, you can go ahead and see like the raise your hand option there.
While we're waiting for questions, I will just say that, like, as I mentioned, it's been quite a roller coaster with hydrogen specifically, but a whole, lot of other bills that go into all of these false solutions that Alejandria and that Julia talked about. Corinne talked about. And so we send out like action alerts. You can put it like it's on any of our like social medias. So whenever there's a bill that like is really promoting one of these false solutions, we want our community to like stand strong and stand united against them, because this is this is something that would affect all of us, and it's vital that when we're building the foundations for what our next generation is going to live through, that we do it in a good way and in the right way. And so, yeah, if any of you are like interested in getting more involved with like some of the calls to action, like testifying in these committee rooms or sending emails or phone calls, we're going to be sending out lots more action alerts throughout the next like week and a half until the session is over. And I'm sure even after the session, there's going to be more calls to action after that. So I just wanted to uplift that, we'll be sending out lots of opportunities to get involved throughout the rest of the session as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you very, very much. What's it called? We actually have a question in the chat from Becca Davis. The question is there a certain legislator that continues to bring hydrogen back to the table that's to blame for this? Or one that should be targeted specifically in addition to the committee members?
So I'd definitely invite any of the other panelists, if you know better, to jump in. But I will say that like out of I think the first hydrogen bill and the one being heard tonight, I'm unsure of the one HB 227, but HB 4 and HB 228 have both been sponsored by Representative Lundstrom. And so I think, that's someone who's very consistently pushing this. And also just know that like a lot of this pressure is coming directly from the governor. And so, she is putting a lot of pressure on all of like the committee members that will be hearing these bills. So I think it's very important to like put pressure on pretty much every committee member, like especially the Democratic ones anyway. But sorry, I see Alejandria, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for chipping off a bit of that, Seneca. I think we've seen a lot of, somebody put Representative Small, and I think it's important to mention what you just said, Seneca, is that there's a lot of pressure coming from behind what we would say is our own, like the Democrats, because what we're seeing is when it comes to the hydrogen bills, really they're being voted along party lines. So it's important that we tell a lot of the folks, that across the board, we don't want hydrogen. I know Representative Smalls keeps bringing up this argument that there's $8 billion that's going to be brought into New Mexico, and we've got to be ready for hydrogen. But again, it's like, if we follow the money, you should see who is pushing that, who is really funding that $8 billion. And it's fossil fuels. I mean, they wouldn't be behind a lot of these things if it was actually a climate solution, if we actually got away from that. Because what we haven't talked about, and what Yucca and folks have really been engaged in, is pushing again for actual renewables, real solutions. Wind and solar, we know in New Mexico that is a huge solution, so why not put our best foot forward to invest in that? So I'll pass it off to Corin.
Recording in progress.
Oh, my bad. Okay, so I just wanted to also get onto this as well. And if you go actually to the nmlegis.gov website, it's the New Mexico Legislature website. You can actually go up to legislation, go to bill finder, and go to keyword and type in the keyword hydrogen. And it'll pull up all the bills that have the keyword hydrogen in it. Right now it's looking like 12 bills. And like they said, the Hydrogen Hub Development Act was originally proposed or sponsored by Representative Lundstrom, Representative Small, Representative Martinez, and Representative Garcia. And it was presented to the House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. And then now it's being just sponsored by Representative Lundstrom. And it looks like the other ones broke off. The other representatives who sponsored the original hydrogen bill are now sponsoring the Clean Future Act. So that's suspicious and weird. So pay attention to that bill too. And also pay attention to HB 55, which is the Public-Private Partnership Act. So you can just go online. The legislative website is really helpful to really track down who and the what about these hydrogen bills.
I appreciate it very much. We actually have another question in the chat too as well from Christina Thompson. The question was, in addition to pursuing Real Zero, achieving a just transition to clean energy has been another topic of discussion. Could the panelists talk about what a just transition to clean energy looks like to you, or what you would want to see in a just transition?
I would be curious to hear what Seneca could update us on what Yucca's been working on with some of the public utilities work. But from SWAP's perspective, we've been working with a couple of national alliances to talk about building a regenerative economy, right? So when we talk about climate, we can't just talk about energy. We have to talk about building a feminist economy. We have to talk about job transition, because I know, especially for our rural folks, that's their concerns. But we want to talk about real jobs that aren't going to involve us being at the beck and call of fossil fuel industries that will close down and will just leave a lot of our workers hanging, which is what has happened here in New Mexico. Another piece that I was going to say is, I was brought to talk about militarization. We got to talk about that. We have to talk about, this other piece too of, we want public backed science, not studies on carbon offsets that say that they're great, that are backed by, these lobbyists, and also centering Indigenous and land-based knowledge when we consider this. Because, I always bring up the point that New Mexico is a harsh climate. It's an arid place, but so many of our ancestors and folks who've lived here for a while know what that is to be in balance with those elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it really well, but I'll just add on that I think a just transition, a lot of it would look like public power and energy democracy. So, I mean, we recently, if you want to learn a little bit more about it, Yucca also recently held an energy democracy convergence that we've, recorded, and it's on YouTube that you can watch through, but just as kind of a highlight reel. Yeah, I mean, I think it looks like, having power in communities' hands. And I think every community is different and has their own needs, whether they're big or small, or, who makes up the community members and cultural backgrounds and all of that. And so I think having communities having the ability to make decisions for themselves regarding where their energy comes from and what they want to do with it is really important, because right now, we're under such a monopoly by PNM and other energy corporations here in New Mexico. And a lot of times, ratepayers have to end up paying for, oh, sorry, my camera's going. Sadness. But the ratepayers have to be paying for any of their irresponsible investments into oil and gas, or into these power plants, or any number of things. And so I think a piece of it would be looking like communities having power in their own hands to make decisions about what energy and where and how, and all the different pieces that come along with that. And specifically, I think having things like community solar could be really important too. I mean, that was something that only just went through last legislative session, I think. And yeah, just putting the power back into the hands of the people. And I think that would feed a little bit into what Alejandra was saying about, I don't know, as we transition, making sure that we're not leaving anyone behind. Because I think something that's brought up a lot is job creation, or that a lot of, I guess, low income communities are relying on these jobs at oil and gas facilities, which is, true. And so making sure that as we transition, we're doing job training programs and all sorts of stuff like that, just to continue to make sure that people aren't, left behind, or left left out as we transition to a cleaner economy. So I hope that was able to cover some of it, but that's one of Yucca's core demands. And I think, we've done a lot of work on it over the years. So I think we can, hopefully our energy democracy convergence can help cover some more of the things that I might have forgot or left out. I think we might have lost Trenton.
I was just gonna say that. So maybe Alejandra, do you want to finish this panel off and we can go into the next?
Yeah, Corin, I was just gonna give you the last word, and I saw Lisa talked, put a good comment about land back and water back. I just was gonna ask if you wanted to talk a little bit about any of that with Pueblo Action, and I could make a link for resources so we can move on to the next panel too. But I was gonna give you the last word.
Okay, real quick, I'm about to jump off to actually join this hearing for HB 228, which is the Hydrogen Hub Act reincarnated for the third time. But in terms of water back and land back, there's a lot of really great information that we took the time to research and learn about and translate into easier terms for our communities, specifically for our communities who aren't part of these conversations. So you are all welcome to visit the link that we'll drop in the chat and go to our website. We have a lot of different campaigns going on, like No False Solutions campaign. We have our youth programming. We also have all the resources that we mentioned in this. We actually have a campaign called Water Back, and I know Julia later on in their panel will speak more on that, but it's the idea that if we call for land back, but if we have land back and there's no water, then what happens? What do we do then? So we really need to be also asking for water back. And as Pueblo people here in the Southwest in New Mexico, we have ultimate water rights here, as Pueblo people, as the first people of this land, paramount water rights. And Julie will talk more about that, but you can learn more about that campaign on our website too. You can print out all this information, as many as you want, and disseminate it to your communities, all for free. We're also down to talk to you guys and even host workshops around like free prior informed consent, also around like the Greater Chaco region, and the impacts of oil and gas industry in the Greater Chaco region. Just reach out to us. We're all friendly. Just like to end with that, and I'm going to actually jump onto this hearing. Thank you all. Thank you so much for listening.
Take care, Corin. You'll stay safe. Give them hell. All right, I appreciate that, y'all. I appreciate the panelists for being here and uplifting your knowledge and getting back to our roots as a bottom-up organizing, especially uplifting our grassroots organizations, our grassroots education, and really being here and uplifting this conversation too as well. I'm sorry, my internet was a little wonky, but I am back. But I am gonna go ahead and pass the baton. Now I'm gonna pass these tide knots over to Seneca. It's your revolt now. It's your turn.
All right, I'll do my best. I'll carry on. My camera is not working for some reason, so we'll see how long it lasts before it turns off again. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here, for being part of this last, for being here for this last panel. And yeah, even though I know that there's a lot going on with HB 228 also being heard, I hope that y'all will be able to still stay for this next panel. There's a lot of really great information. Yeah, as mentioned before, I'm Seneca with Yaka. I'm a campaign organizer and co-founder, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next panel on why Indigenous leadership against net zero and other false solutions is vital. So we have Beneshi Albert, co-executive director of Climate Justice Alliance, Tom Goldtooth, the executive director of the Indigenous Environmental Network, and Julia Bernal, executive director of Pueblo Action Alliance. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge. I think first we can start off with Mr. Tom Goldtooth. Thank you so much for being here. And the first kind of question that we have for you is, what was your first encounter with carbon trading? And as an Indigenous leader in a global climate justice movement, how did you respond to the notion of commodifying what is sacred, or the commodification of clean air? So it's
okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great question, and thank you everyone who's hosting this. The best Nashli, well, Dakota Bashish Chi, hello, all my relations. It's a good evening, and I like to be able to respond as best as I can to your question on both Dene and Dakota, director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. I got involved with climate change and actually with the mandate coming out of the conference gathering in Albuquerque in November 1998. It was called Circles of Wisdom. It was sponsored by federal dollars, but working with some of our brothers and sisters who brought this meeting together with ICU, the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy, Pat Spears and Robert Goff, and who I had already been working with in 1998 in my capacity with Indigenous Environmental Network. And it was a Native peoples, Native homelands climate change workshop. And there were about 180 Native people that participated. And part of our role as IEN is that we challenged the federal agencies and the tribes that we needed to get grassroots community groups, organizations to this meeting, and also traditional practitioners, spiritual leadership, which they acknowledge that request. And that's what we worked on, and bringing constituency to that meeting. And I mentioned this because there was I stated a lot of the as much data as I can at that time to come to that meeting. And within IEN, we already were getting some requests from some of our constituencies, like our elder Oren Lyons from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that said we should start working on climate issues. And but it was really a good opportunity to hear the presentations from everyone as we started to share our notes and data, both as with tribal, there weren't that many, but there were already in 1998 tribal staff within tribal environmental protection programs, some elected tribal leadership, and traditional people. We were able to get Orville Looking Horse there, the keeper with our Lakota, Nakota, Dakota bundle, elders, spiritual leaders like Tom Stillday from the Red Lake Ojibwe Nation here in Minnesota. So we played a role in that. But I'm saying this as a response because the foundation of the discussion, I really appreciated with our traditional people centered on our ceremonies. It's centered on our original instructions, our traditional knowledge as a foundation to begin talking about this climate crisis in 1998 and talking about prophecies. And I was selected to take a statement from that 1998 gathering to Buenos Aires for the fourth Conference of the Parties of the World Governments of the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. I went to that meeting with carrying the statement from that meeting. And that was kind of like my introduction to the world community and this governments and the World Bank, the large non-governmental organizations, the big enviros, and started to really learn about the contradictions of participants that on the world level, on the global level, but also many of them come from the United States. And I saw a lot of double talk, a lot of concerns and issues, in fact, that what you're addressing this evening.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I guess you talked a little bit about how so much of the conversation was centered on ceremony and on like the traditional knowledge and values. So yeah, I want to hear a little bit more about what your feeling was when you saw like all of the talk about commodification of these are resources and these sacred entities?
Yeah, I don't have enough time to go into the depth of the question because there's a history within the global climate negotiations. I mean, part of the mandate coming out of the 1992 Earth Summit was to address climate issues in 1992. It took a couple years for world leaders and to start initiating a process to have these conference of the parties. Again, the parties are the governmental representatives of the world, the governments participating in these United Nations meetings. And the goal is to come up with solutions to mitigate, to find solutions for this problem of the rising concentration of greenhouse gases, and also to start talking about how do the government survive, how do they adapt, so mitigation and adaptation. So in 1997, for some of you taking notes, look up the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol actually was a mechanism that opened the door to introducing emissions trading mechanisms, carbon trading mechanisms. And so that created a whole process, a file, you could say, about this, the complexity of bringing a capitalism market system, a trading system like Wall Street into mitigation of this problem with the heavy concentration and compounding change related to the overdumping of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, okay? And I try to always look at the discussions and the positions of these UN climate meetings from an indigenous perspective, whether it's the Net teachings or the Dakota teachings, and I went back a lot, starting in that 1998, 99, and the following 2000, 2001, 2002. Every year since I started to get involved, the discussion around the priorities of bringing a market system as an answer to mitigating climate change became to be a big discussion. And I remember the way I understood it was that they have to put a price to carbon. They have to inventory carbon in the environment, in the ecosystem, in this case within trees, forested area of the global south. The mechanism was called reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And I was looking at the large NGOs who were pushing this, and it was confusing. I could not get answers. I read documents backwards, upside down, but I understood it was a market system of capitalism that brought a way that they have to inventory the carbon in the forests. I looked at where that carbon that comes from the atmosphere and looked at the carbon that is in the ground. And there's some scientific differences in this that some scientists were raising as contradictions that were never adequately addressed. So within this RED mechanism, we as IEN later started to develop our own popular education, calling this out. I consulted with a lot of spiritual leaders back here, home in the North, but also spiritual leaders. I met indigenous leaders of the global South from the Amazon and said, how does this work? What do you think about a mechanism where they have to privatize, they have to put a monetary value on the carbon, the inventory of carbon in the trees, but also in the grass, in the mangroves, in nature. And then they use that mechanism by pricing, allowing the corporations to trade carbon credits, pieces of paper with each other that really, it's the polluters who are buying the carbon credits. That is a form of greenwashing where they don't reduce carbon emissions. For an example, in Richmond, California, to where this is kind of my interpretation of a conversation I had with local communities in Richmond. They have respiratory illnesses, and there's a lot of people of color, including some relocated Native people or urban Indians living in that area. And they've been always addressing the toxic emissions from Chevron, the toxic emissions from the refineries in Richmond outside of San Francisco. So they say, you know, in the climate crisis, why aren't you reducing your emissions? We are dying. And in my interpretation, my translation of the conversation they told me, basically the Chevron says, you don't understand. We are going carbon neutral. We are offsetting our pollution, our carbon here in Richmond. So the community said, I don't understand. We continue to see emissions from the smokestack of your oil refinery. The Chevron says, you don't understand. We are actually balancing and going carbon neutral on the amount of carbon. And they said, how are you doing that? They said, we are buying carbon credits to protect the trees of the Amazon. And the community says, we don't understand that either. In the meantime, while you are doing that, your emissions are increasing here in our backyard. So I use that as an example of the problems that have come out of these negotiations, where it's pretty much status quo for us as a network raising this issue up years after years. Eventually, I have even had foundations say, Tom, you guys need to slow down on this. We can give you money for adaptation, but slow down on this mitigation issue. Basically, a lot of foundations are invested in climate capitalism. And you can see that the laying down of big money from Jeff Bezos to NGOs who are funding and supporting geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen energy, but also carbon markets. Same with Elon Musk and other folks putting big money. It's big money, money talks. So we are fighting, yes, CO2 colonialism. We have put a language to this as opposition to colonialism, systems change, spinning the patriarchy that's involved with this, the militarization, objectification of Mother Earth, the same way that the modern society objectifies our women.
Yeah, thank you for all that important context, and also for going into a little bit more, what the reality of like living nearby, somewhere that is in these carbon markets and is buying these offsets and claiming that they're being net zero or that they're clean, and yeah, going into like some of what the reality of it looks like for the people there. So I know if we're fast forwarding to where we're at now, if you could briefly maybe go over what you're witnessing with some of the Native groups in New Mexico that are fighting against, these carbon trading and carbon offsetting schemes.
Yeah, I can't put into words what I'm feeling in my heart. I mean, I just want to shake your all hands and, say, hey, right on, aho, the resistance of many of the groups that's hosting this and who are speaking on this. I must say straight up, it's very difficult to fight a dominant society and to fight colonialism and its roots within this country's solution to addressing climate change. I like to say that there's major differences between whether it's Democrats or Republicans, but it's all part of capitalism. Neoliberalism right now is what we're fighting. The filter around our president is invested in false solutions. A lot of the foundations, and we're continuing to work with foundations to educate them, and we are making progress. In the last conference of the party 26 in Glasgow, that's the most that we have seen in the streets of non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations globally that have educated themselves, like on the carbon pricing volume 1 publication that we did. Very layperson terminology, are the hoodwink. We're continuing to educate from the grassroots up. So it's challenging back in our homeland in New Mexico. It's challenging to get an audience from our tribal councils. And I've been there many times. And a lot of the way that it's being spun as far as from the state level, but from the federal level to tribal nations around pushing investing in carbon capture and storage, investing in carbon trading, using our trees and saying, we'll give you money for forest management to enhance your forests and just participate, we'll give you money. But there's just lies woven into that, to where tribes are not given all the information. We have actually followed some tribes to where, they say, well, the money comes from where? I asked, where does the money come from? They said, well, we're told it comes from the state of California. I said, that money comes from Chevron and the polluting industry to offset their pollution and using you as a participant in this scam. And some tribal leaders are very appalled at being lied to. But big money talks. Some of these contracts that are being negotiated are very enticing to tribal leadership because they can amount to millions of dollars over a 90-year contract, millions of dollars per year, you participating in carbon offset schemes. I think that our advice has always been, yes, continue to do what you can to put presentations on with tribal decision makers, but it's the traditional people, it's our women's societies that we feel have been very successful. Who are the traditional practitioners of the Pueblos? Who's the ones there with the Apaches and our Diné people that we need to talk to? It's the women, the grannies, the aunties, the mothers, and the sisters and nieces. And that will understand from their heart. That's been successful, and the spiritual leadership. And I know it's difficult culturally, on who has access to your spiritual leadership. We got to look at every different avenue. We're getting some success from the non-native organizations. Some of them, though, are funded. We got to go in with both eyes open on who are the allies and the ones who are fixer-uppers, who say, we hear what you're saying, Pueblo Action Alliance, but it's going to happen anyway. Let's negotiate. Let's develop safe mechanisms to prevent those things you're concerned about. We've seen a lot of these as excuses, and we're holding the line, and we're there to support you in any way we can. There's other Native people who are confronted with these challenges of how do we create a constructive dialogue with our tribal leadership to make a stand with us against these false solutions.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for, being like standing with us and holding the line, and also, for, already doing, having been doing the work yourself. I think as someone, like, just for me personally, I'm kind of new to, all of these like carbon markets and carbon tradings and understanding what they are. And a lot of it has only been, because of Pueblo Action Alliance and all of these, absolutely like incredible Pueblo leaders who have been like educating me and other people on all of these issues. And so I really appreciate that perspective.
One thing I want to say, just 1 minute, please, is that most effective approach I have used with spiritual leadership. It's one thing is explaining how this process works for mitigating climate and using market system, carbon offsets, carbon trading. How does that really work of them putting a monetary value to carbon and how they're bringing it into a market, a white man market system. And as they begin to understand this, really the question is, how do we reconcile with our own traditions to participate in an evil system? To participate in a climate pricing carbon trading mechanism is a violation of the sacred. There's no way of redefining that. How do we convey that to our traditional people? And if we choose to participate then for maybe just transition monies, if we want to participate for $1 million to participate in forest management, but they have to know that we also are participating in the problem to where it does not mitigate, it does not cut emissions. It's a scam, but it's a lie, but also traditionally, where is it that in our tradition, there's going to be we have to put a balance on what we're doing now that's a violation of our teachings and a violation of the sacred. We are concerned of the decision makers and their families. That's what was one medicine person told me one time. He said, I'm concerned of those who are participating in this, who signed the contract, because it can jeopardize the future of that person's family to do that. So these are things I talk with traditional people. How do we reconcile our people participating in such a system? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You give so much like really amazing knowledge just in those past couple minutes. And so I really appreciate getting to hear from you and getting to, help be part of sharing all of your experience with everyone. Thank you. Yeah, next I'll go ahead and jump over to Julia. So thank you again, Julia, for being here and for helping to organize all this. I know that you've been really involved in a lot of the academia that's particularly around water resources. So you come from a very technical perspective and also have, a Western science understanding in addition to, your Indigenous analysis on these false solutions. So I'm really grateful to have, your perspective represented as well. So the first question that we have for you is pertaining to hydrogen. Why is hydrogen production water resource intensive? And why is it a bad solution for New Mexico?
Thank you, Seneca. And before I go into that question, I just want to, give my respects to Tom and also Benishi, who will be speaking on a lot of the feminist paradigm shifts that is happening in climate justice movement, because we really, and of course there's many on this call like Sophia Martinez, Donna House, who have gifted some people like me and those within our organization the information that they obtained throughout their movement experience. And we stand on their shoulders because this is a continuum of that work. And us as younger people are now in similar positions of having to question why we know those that can support an evil system, a system that wasn't made for us as Indigenous people. But in regards to the question, we've been talking a lot about hydrogen throughout this webinar, and those of us that have been at the legislature confronting our policymakers, other non-governmental organizations, and our community members on why hydrogen is not a viable or sustainable solution for climate mitigation or adaptation, is that hydrogen is a very resource intensive production system, similar to oil and gas. It takes many resources for hydrogen production, and it's being sold as a clean energy. It's rooted in lies, it's rooted in fallacies. And so when it comes to living in a very arid place, semi-arid place like the Southwest, we are already having climate change stress our existing cultural and natural resources, water being the biggest one here. Water is sometimes undermined in the sense of importance, because many of us, turn the faucet on and we see water. And so, we don't think twice about how this industry is impacting our water resources. And for hydrogen uses a lot of water as feedback in order for the splitting of methane, natural gas into hydrogen. And so we know that because we are already facing so much threat to our current water resources and waterways and systems, that hydrogen is just creating another exploitive industry that is going to use fresh water for energy production. And what makes this also very harmful is that hydrogen is being deemed as a clean energy. Seneca, you did a really amazing job of explaining like the differences of hydrogen. A lot of this is to deter us from really understanding that this is just a continuum of the fossil fuel industry. Many of us in the Greater Chaco Coalition that have been fighting against oil and gas in the San Juan Basin or the Greater Chaco landscape under the federal fossil fuel leasing program have all understood that this is just a continuum of that industry, that exploitive and extractive industry. And so it's been a lot of our work at Pueblo Action Alliance to bring the grassroots together, bring those that understand water, bring those that understand oil and gas and energy and climate issues, bring those that really understand like how the legislative system works, and those that have been also cultivating and practicing Indigenous knowledge, because we essentially are trying to come up with solutions within the same market that caused these climate catastrophes in the first place. And so we talk, and I wanted to just point on one more thing about this conversation around drought, is even that we talk about the drought as if it's a temporary sort of state, like we're in drought, maybe kind of in alluding to an assumption that we're going to get out of drought. But what we really need to understand is that climate change is rising our temperatures, it's rising evaporation rates, and it's causing what we call like an aridification. And we are going to have to start thinking about how to adapt instead of mitigate climate change, because one of my spiritual leaders that I've talked to here in Sandia Pueblo was asked about his Indigenous perspective on climate change. And he said, well, the Pueblos, they either would move and migrate. We can't do that anymore because we're bound to our reservations, and we can't relocate. Or we can adapt, or we can die. And that's the reality. And so for us, we have to think about how we're going to change with the climate. And our ancestors had did that in the past. There was a point where there weren't any geopolitical borders or political jurisdictions or urban cities that disallowed us to migrate and adapt to changing climate. And so we have to think about that in this reality, because I don't think that we can reverse what we've done, but we have to, take those hard pills to swallow and really think about what Tom was saying, thinking about the next generations like ahead of us, what are we going to leave them? Just like the same things like our ancestors left us, which is Chaco Canyon, the Caja del Rio, all of these indigenous sacred sites that our ancestors left us, we should be thinking similarly, like what are we going to leave behind? And hopefully that isn't destruction, catastrophe, and chaos.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for going like so in depth about like exactly, why, water is so, sorry, why the whole process is so like water intensive, but also, the importance of being able to like not only like look back at where we came from, but look forward, because, we have to be thinking about, I always like how people say you have to think about what kind of ancestor you're going to be. We're only here because, the people before us had that foresight, for us. And so it's really important that we're thinking down the line too. Yeah, and so when it comes to offsetting schemes, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how the carbon trading market will be impacting New Mexico specifically.
That's a great question, because the biggest worry that I think I had, I remember it was 2018, 2019. Me and Reyes DeVore, we went to Chicago for the very first carbon trading training that was hosted by the Indigenous Environmental Network and their coalition with Climate Justice Alliance and Global Grassroots Justice, was that offsetting can come in any form because it's an entirely made up market. We were joking that, here in Indian country, you could probably create a res dog offsetting scheme, figure out some sort of ridiculous number that a res dog can offset carbon, because that's essentially what they're doing. They're using really poor science and getting corporations to back this research to quantify carbon sequestration. And if, just in some of my studies, I've been learning about like how we measure density and mass of the different mixtures of greenhouse gases. And it really depends on so many different factors. It depends on temperature. It depends on elevation. It depends on climate. It depends on the amount of water vapor that's existing in our air. So being able to quantify carbon sequestration and turn that into a market-based credit is just absolutely ridiculous and totally untrue and based off of a system of lies. You can't scientifically, you can't virtually quantify how much carbon is being sequestered in some certain place because of all these factors. And now, because we're facing climate change, we are seeing rising temperatures, and that is ultimately also going to impact how carbon is sequestered naturally. For New Mexico, we are blessed with beautiful cultural landscapes, high desert, high altitude forests, and we also have an abundance of traditional agriculture. All of those beautiful and sacred landscapes and are essentially up on the chopping block to be commodified for offsetting. It can essentially happen to the agricultural sector, because there's a large movement to move water from agriculture here in New Mexico. There's a lot of fallowing incentives that are happening through state mechanisms, but there is going to be a need for a supplementary market with agricultural fallowing, because farmers aren't going to make enough, and we can definitely see how offsetting schemes and carbon trading companies can come in here and deem this this market as a way to combat and mitigate climate change. And it's not true. It's a trick and it's a lie. And so, we really want to ensure that we're providing, again, this education to all of those that inhabit and occupy New Mexico, so that way they can understand that if we codify offsetting into New Mexico law, we are opening up our state to a global market. We already have a hard time of holding oil and gas accountable for the mess that they've made. How are we going to hold an entirely new economic global market while we're already low in capacity when it comes to, you know, oversight for oil and gas and other exploitation? And so, you know, New Mexico, we knew that New Mexico was going to be this guinea pig state for a lot of these false solution initiatives. And we're seeing that happen right now. And we just really hope that those that are watching or watch this later can also stand with us as we continue to fight against all false solutions. It doesn't matter if it's hydrogen or offsetting or net zero or whatever it is. Like, we have to do what's right, and we have to take bold action now.
I really appreciate you going more in depth with that, especially because I think a lot of times, you know, these I don't know, they seem kind of more like abstract, or like people seem to exist that like these ideas of offsets just like exist in a vacuum without understanding like this is going to have very real impacts on people, our communities. And, you know, it's not just going to be something far away or something you never have to think about, because this is, you know, what's going to be the reality if we're not able to, you know, really stand united against this and to stop it. So I appreciate you going, you know, more in depth and letting people know a little bit more about, you know, the dangers of this. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think now we'll go to our last panelist, which would be Beneshi Albert. Please let me know if I'm saying your name right, but yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and for, you know, of course, all the work that you've been doing for communities. I know that you're one of the co-directors for Climate Justice Alliance and one of the organizations within It Takes Roots with the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Grassroots Global Justice, and Climate Justice Alliance, and Right Into the City. So, you know, you've been doing a lot of work, and just really appreciate everything that you've been doing. So yeah, I just want to welcome you to the space.
Fasa. Benishi A Zati Ujiha Anishinaabe Kedan Tasahe Dochini. So my name is Benishi Albert, and it's good to see some familiar faces and glad to see lots of other extra faces here. And yeah, you know, yes, I'm one of the co-directors with the Climate Justice Alliance, and organization is 74, 75, continues to grow up, member organizations from across the nation. Some of those local base building organizations, some national organizations, and a few who work internationally, including IEN, who works both nationally and internationally. And yeah, you know, it's been really good to listen to like all of this happening and think about like both the perspective of what it means to like organize around this sort of market system based on carbon, but also, you know, thinking about the perspectives of what it means for us as community people and just people in general. Like, what does this system mean? And for me, you know, at the basic core is if you create a system, a market system that is based on the existence of carbon, you create a demand for that carbon to exist, right? And so it just seems like a very backwards way of trying to address a crisis problem. And so, you know, I was just thinking about that in this context of like listening to all of the comments. And, you know, I think this is the major shift that we have to have as a nation or as a country or even as the world, and thinking about how do we address this climate crisis and addressing, you know, reducing carbon, is that we have to think about it from the perspective of healing and healing the damage versus focusing on how can the economy exist? And right now, most of the world governments are looking at the solution to climate change as a market solution, which will always benefit and serve the corporations and those holding, the greatest to gain by way of profits, right? But if you have leadership who are thinking about the climate crisis from a place of like, how do we undo the damage we've caused to Mother Earth and to people, they create policies in a different way. They create regulations in a different way. And they even look at what the economy could be in a different way. And right now, most of our leadership is dealing with the climate crisis from a way of how do we make sure the economy survives? Because, when I think about the damage that has been caused by, this crisis and like addressing carbon reductions, I think about the industries that have, polluted through, fossil fuels and an energy resource that is dirty. And it's not dirty only because it's created carbon that is causing, all of this other damage in the atmosphere. It's dirty in its extraction from the earth. It's dirty in its processing. It's dirty in the contamination that it causes to communities who live along the fence line of those facilities that are processing this energy. And a lot of the solutions, when they talk about some of these other solutions, earlier we heard some of the false solutions being pushed around hydrogen and others, they said, well, these are clean energy sources. And they say they're clean because they don't produce carbon, but they're not clean in the damage that they cause to the earth. They're not clean in the damage that they cause to the water. And they're definitely not clean in the damage that they cause to people, to ourselves, to our being. And so we have to demand of our governments to look at environmental policy and climate change policy first from the perspective of mitigating the harm that has been caused to land and people, and looking at the economy after that, right? The economy is going to fall in its place, but we cannot create a system, and we can't support a system that creates a demand for the existence of carbon. Like, you create a market system where people are like trading and trading carbon offsets, and even for tribal nations to become dependent on those sort of carbon markets to exist, you create a demand for that carbon to exist. And that doesn't benefit us as people. It doesn't benefit us as Indigenous people, as community people, as people of color, as people who are living along the fence line of all of those industries. Like, it doesn't benefit us. It only benefits the corporations who are holding those facilities that are processing this dirty fuel, this dirty energy. And so that's the paradigm shift that I think we need to have, is really about like how we are leading with the solutions. Because if you lead from the solutions of like what is going to be beneficial to the people and to the community, you come up with a different set of solutions that are not large scale market scam shell games, right? Like, it's not that. You come up with solutions of like, how can people produce energy that they need in their community, that is community controlled, that doesn't cause harm, that is sustainable, that they can have for the long haul, and is affordable. Those are the kind of solutions that communities are coming up with. And they're doing it with sometimes very little support from their governments. They're doing it anyway because that's what they need. They're going to need it in their community, and they're trying to build some sustainability and safety for the communities, despite what's happening on the large scale with, the fossil fuel industry. So I guess those are two paradigm shifts, but those are the paradigm shifts that I can think of right now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for going into that. I mean, I think I also really appreciate that you brought up the point specifically of like, if we're creating markets that are like based on carbon, then of course there's going to be a demand for carbon. I think that's something that it seems to fly over a lot of people's heads, I guess, when they talk about how important it is in the transition, and how all of, like, I don't know, all of these different ideas on why it's necessary when, really it's not, it's just prolonging the fossil fuel industry. So I really appreciate you bringing up that point. And then, talking about the paradigm shifts and why they're important. So another question that we have for you that I think you've touched on a little bit, but maybe if you want to go more in depth. So Pueblo Action Alliance, SWAP, and Yucca have been creating campaigns and popular opportunities to, say no to false solutions. But we're always met with a lot of pushback from big environmental organizations and policymakers and private industry. And, they're saying things like, well, what else would we do? Or, what are the alternatives? And yeah, I was wondering if you had kind of a response to that type of pushback. Oh, can you not hear me? Oh no.
Sorry, I got stuck on mute for a second. So yeah, I started to say this thing about alternatives. Like, I think when you're looking at solutions and alternatives that serve the market, that serve like this large scale, like you have to think large scale, like, oh, we have to do this large solar array, or we have to create this huge wind farm. That's because that is a solution that is based on like serving a small set of corporations who hold, most of the energy production in the country, right? And so because it serves them, like they're looking at like, oh, how can we supplant what we're earning now with something else, right? And so this is why they're the ones who are creating this narrative like, oh, that these are not solutions that are viable. And they create this narrative that gets picked up by politicians who say, well, what are the solutions we're supposed to do? Like, we can't think of anything else to do. It's because they're thinking that the only solution is that to come up with some large scale like installation. And really, one of the paradigm shift I was saying earlier is that like, we really need to think about like, how do we decentralize the power? There's one power company in New Mexico, right? Or, how do we decentralize that and create systems that, belong to communities, belong to the communities in Sandia and the community in Barreras and communities, all along the river. Like, how do they hold the energy that they're producing and use and responsible for it and the creating of it, and the resource and the profit sits with them, right? That's a different kind of way of looking at like solutions. And when people say, oh, there's no alternatives, is because they don't want to see the decentralization of corporate monopolies, right? This is what we live with right now. We live with corporations who hold energy monopolies across the country, across the nation. Even some of these corporations have international holdings. It's not that hard to follow the money and see, the corporations who are holding not only the purse strings of how people are accessing energy in their local communities, but they hold the purse strings for many of the politicians that we have to deal with, right? They're funding big political campaigns to ensure that they have big wins in the midterm elections. And so, we have to be able to like push back and say, the solution is not always bigger is better. The solution may be that what we need is a multitude of smaller localized projects. The scale we need is thousands of projects happening, not like a solar array of 1,000, 1,000 panels somewhere. What we need are thousands and thousands of smaller community projects happening, and having that kind of support. That's the kind of support we need from our governments. It was like, how do we make this happen? How do we make wind and solar happen in a smaller community and resource that and let them hold the production and responsibility and care of that and what it means for their community. I think, in terms of, some of those other alternatives, we have to hold their feet to the fire when they say, oh, these alternatives that we're supporting now are clean. They're not clean just because they're carbon free, because nuclear is never going to be clean no matter how hard they try to slice it. Like nuclear is never clean. It's not clean in its extraction from the earth. It's not clean in its processing and packaging. It's not clean in its waste. And all of those three, intervention points are usually in indigenous communities where the extraction happens, where the processing happens, where the waste gets stored. Those happen in a lot of times in indigenous communities, but it's not a clean source. Hydrogen is not a clean source. And so, but we also have to be able to say, here's what we want people to do instead. And right now, if there's not the support from the government to do that, like I said, like communities are just doing it. They're doing it where they can, and they're making that happen. Sometimes there's government support and sometimes there's not, just recently, like New Jersey had this incredible legislation around environmental justice that was like huge and was about to set precedent for lots of other communities to use. And the governor tried to like go around it, even though he was part of like helping pass it. And then just recently was like, oh, wait, but we still want to build this one more power plant in this community with like poor, brown, Black, working class people. And, they had to hold his feet to the fire too. And I think now they have a case against him. I don't know. I feel like there's a lawsuit that's happening around that right now. But it's our responsibility if our politicians are willing to, blindly follow industry and what industry is saying the right way to go. It's our responsibility as community people to hold our politicians accountable to what needs to be the solutions coming from communities. And if we have to like create the models to show that, let's do that. But also let's like create the space to like create policy and programs that support those projects happening. Like, let's create a fund, for communities to be able to access to say, hey, in this neighborhood or in this school, we want to do a community solar project, or we want to, and create a fund for people to do that, create incentives for people to have solar in their home, create tax breaks for people to use that, like create, opportunities and training and skills building and scholarships for, students to go in this kind of field of work. These are the kind of things that we have, instead of thinking about our only way out of this is to create big scale solutions. The big scale we need is thousands of smaller community solutions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like, yes to every single thing you said. So thank you so much for like putting that all in words the way you did. Like that was so great. Yeah, I mean, I think we're just about out of time. I think.
Oh, I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question, Tom, about utility politics in the state of New Mexico. Let's just say there's a whole soap opera drama you could like sketch out of a like cartoon on that stuff. So
Yeah.
And maybe somebody will do that, like capture those. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think if people have any questions, I don't know if we'll have a whole lot of time, but if people do have questions, feel free to put in the chat. I just want to once again really thank Tom Goldtooth, Julia Bernal, and Benicia Albert for all being here and sharing their knowledge, and doing so in such like just and like coherent and like amazing way. So thank you so much. Yeah, again, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat, but I'll probably pass it to Alejandria if you want to have any like closing announcements or anything. I know the other hearings going on now. I wasn't sure if that's like something time sensitive that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Seneca. Really quickly, the announcement we wanted to make is definitely folks that have heard today about hydrogen. There is a hearing happening right now. The actual opposing comment for the bill is happening. We dropped the link in the chat. The other reminder we wanted to give to you all is that this is a part 2. Day 2 will take place at the same time at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We're going to have other folks from the Sister Alliances of Just Transition Alliance. We'll have also Los Jardines Institute being represented by Sofia Martinez, and GTA will be represented by Jose Bravo and Ananda Lee Tan. And so thank you all for being here. Please join us tomorrow. If you haven't registered for day 2, we'll drop the Zoom link in the chat for those who are here. And yeah, just thank you so much to all of our panelists for your time. It's great to see so many great faces, and to realize that we're not working on all this alone. And sometimes, especially here in the Southwest, it's hard. We're not really centered in a lot of these conversations. So thank you all. And Seneca, I'll pass it back to you.
I didn't really have anything. Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was going to close right at 8, so I just wanted to make sure we had everything in there. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and for just how interactive you've been, and of course, thank you to our panelists. Yeah, I mean, I think we can stay for a little bit if there's any questions, but
I just want to say, like, there's lots of people in this fight with y'all. There's lots of other community organizations just like yours in Washington State, in New Jersey, in South Dakota, and they're all over the place, and they're taking on their governments, sometimes when they're not standing in their best interests. Lots of Indigenous communities, lots of other communities of color, lots of poor communities. Like, people are in this game with you. So thank you all for holding it down in New Mexico.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Yeah, so we'll just stay on for a couple minutes if there's any questions. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming and for being here. We hope to see you tomorrow. And if you have time, please do speak at the hearing that's happening now.